My hands are shaking, and I do not have hands that are supposed to shake. My species does not tremble. We do not lose control of our own limbs. Yet here I am, floating inside my observation pod above a small blue planet, and every part of my body is refusing to obey me. Alarms are screaming through my headset. My monitors are painting the same color over and over again, a deep red warning that means total collapse. Something enormous is dying down there, and I am the only witness in the galaxy who understands what is really happening. 3 days ago, my life was simple. I was bored. I was assigned to the dullest post in the entire outer observation network, watching a species that every senior researcher in my department called harmless, weak, not worth studying. I remember reading the official file before I left my home station. The file said humans were short-lived, disorganized, and prone to fighting each other over meaningless things. It said they had no chance of ever becoming a threat to anyone beyond their own small world. I remember laughing when I read that line, because it was written by someone who clearly never planned to actually watch them. I am not laughing anymore. My name is Zeth, and I was sent here by the Concord, a peaceful alliance of many worlds that watches over young civilizations without interfering in their growth. Our rule is simple. We observe, we record, we never make contact until a species proves it is ready. Most researchers consider this job an honor. I considered it a punishment, because my last research proposal was rejected by the council, and my supervisor decided that watching a slow, backward species called humans would teach me patience. I arrived above Earth 9 local months ago. My ship is cloaked, invisible to their instruments, hidden in a stable orbit far beyond what their scientists can currently detect. I built a small platform there, a floating home filled with sensors, cameras, and translation systems that slowly learned their many languages. At first, everything about this planet felt exactly like the file described. Humans argued constantly. They built walls between their own countries. They fought over land, over food, over ideas that seemed small compared to the size of the universe. I filled my early reports with disappointment. I wrote long paragraphs about how predictable they were, how easy to categorize, how unremarkable. I was wrong about all of it. The change began on an ordinary morning, if you can call anything about that day ordinary. I was monitoring a region on the eastern side of their largest continent, watching two human nations argue over a border dispute that had lasted for generations. It was tedious work, the kind that made me question every decision that led me to this posting. Then my long-range sensors detected something entering the system that did not belong to this planet, and did not belong to my Concord either. A ship, not human, not one of ours. I switched every scanner I had toward the new signal, my curiosity finally awake for the first time in months. The vessel was large, heavily armored, built for war rather than exploration. Its design matched nothing in my database until I cross-referenced it with restricted files from the Outer Rim conflicts. My database returned a single word that made my chest tighten: Thresher. The Threshers are not a species anyone wants to meet. They are an aggressive empire from the outer systems, known across 3 sectors for a simple strategy: find a world with resources, find a species too weak to resist, take everything and leave nothing behind. They do not colonize, they do not trade. They strip a planet of what they want and move on, leaving broken ecosystems and broken people in their path. My people have avoided contact with them for generations, staying far outside their territory, watching from a careful distance the way a smaller animal watches a predator it hopes never notices it exists. According to Concord law, I was required to do exactly one thing in this situation: observe, record, do not interfere. Earth was not yet listed as a protected world, since humans had not developed the technology needed for full contact status. That meant no one was coming to help them. That meant whatever happened next would happen without any outside interference, and I would simply be the silent witness recording it all for a report that would arrive on Concord desks long after the outcome was already decided. I told myself this was simply another data point. Another sad chapter in the long history of stronger species taking advantage of weaker ones. I had seen similar situations before in training simulations, though never in real time, never with my own sensors locked onto the exact coordinates where it would happen. Some quiet part of me expected this observation to be quick and clean. The Threshers would arrive, assess the primitive technology below, and begin their harvest with almost no resistance. I even began drafting the opening lines of my report in my head, describing the tragic but predictable fall of a species that never had a chance. The Thresher ship broke through the upper atmosphere without slowing down, without any attempt to hide its presence. That alone told me everything about how little respect they had for the people below. They did not fear discovery because they did not believe humans capable of stopping them, let alone finding them. My sensors picked up their internal communications, translated slowly through my system, filled with lazy confidence. Their commander, a voice thick with contempt, called this planet an easy target. He said the locals were primitive, unarmed against anything beyond their own crude weapons, and would likely surrender the moment they understood what they were facing. I watched the ship descend over a coastal region, choosing a location near a cluster of human settlements. Cameras on my platform adjusted automatically, giving me a clear view of the moment their landing craft broke through the clouds. Below them, ordinary human life continued without any awareness of what was approaching. Vehicles moved along roads. Children walked toward buildings I understood to be schools. Markets were filled with people trading goods, laughing, arguing about prices, living lives exactly as small and simple as my old reports described. I felt something strange settle over me as I watched. It was not concern. My training told me not to feel concern for subjects under observation. It was something closer to sadness, the kind you feel watching a nature program where a smaller creature has no idea a larger one is circling above it. I remember thinking that within a matter of hours, this quiet coastal region would become a footnote in Thresher history, one more world quietly consumed and forgotten. The landing craft touched down in an open field just outside the largest settlement in the region. Local authorities responded almost immediately, vehicles with flashing lights approaching the massive shape that had just torn a scar into the ground. I expected panic. I expected chaos. I expected exactly the disorganized response my files had always predicted from this species. What I saw instead was the first thing that did not match my expectations. The response was fast, organized, structured in a way that suggested these people had trained for exactly this kind of unexpected event, even without ever imagining it would involve a ship from beyond their own sky. Emergency broadcasts activated within minutes, warning nearby residents to stay clear of the area. Local defense forces arrived, forming a perimeter around the landing site with a discipline that surprised me enough to pause my draft report entirely. The Thresher commander did not seem concerned by any of this. His voice through my translated feed carried the same lazy confidence as before, describing the human response as a minor inconvenience rather than a warning sign. He ordered his forces to exit the landing craft and begin what he called first contact, though I understood from the weapons his soldiers carried that this was not a conversation he intended to have. I watched the hatch of the landing craft open. I watched the first Thresher soldier step onto human soil, tall, armored, moving with the casual arrogance of a being who believed nothing on this world could possibly challenge him. I watched a young human officer step forward to meet him, unarmed, hands raised in what I recognized from months of observation as a universal signal of peaceful intent. For one moment, everything on my monitors went still. The Thresher soldier studied the human officer the way a large predator studies something too small to matter. The human officer studied him back without flinching, without stepping away, without any of the fear I expected to see. I did not know it yet, sitting alone in my cloaked platform high above the clouds, but I was no longer watching the quiet, forgettable species my files described. I was watching the opening moment of something my training had never prepared me to record, something that would force me to rewrite every report I had ever filed about this planet, something that would leave me, 3 days later, shaking in a chair, unable to look away from my own monitors. I did not know that yet, but I was about to find out. The human officer lowered his raised hands slowly, not out of fear, but because the Thresher soldier had not reacted with violence in that first breath of silence. I learned later that his name was Daniel, a regional defense coordinator who had been the closest trained officer to the landing site when the alarms began. I did not know his name yet in that moment. To me, he was simply a data point, a representative sample of a species I still believed incapable of understanding the danger standing in front of him. The Thresher commander stepped out of the landing craft next, taller than his soldiers, his armor marked with symbols I recognized from restricted Concord files as rank insignia belonging to a senior raid leader. He studied the perimeter of human vehicles surrounding his ship with something close to amusement. Through my translated feed, I heard him instruct his soldiers to begin what he called a resource survey, a term the Threshers use instead of the word invasion, as if changing the label could soften what came next. Daniel spoke first. I remember this clearly because it was the first thing that truly surprised me. He did not shout. He did not run. He asked calmly what they wanted and where they had come from. It was a simple question, the kind any reasonable person would ask a stranger who had just torn a hole in a field with a massive metal ship. The Thresher commander did not bother answering. Instead, he gestured toward 2 of his soldiers, who moved past Daniel toward the nearby buildings without pause, weapons raised, scanning devices sweeping across windows and doors. That was the moment the mood on the ground shifted from confusion to something sharper. I watched local defense vehicles reposition, forming a tighter perimeter. I watched more emergency personnel arrive, spreading out along the edges of the field. None of them fired, none of them charged forward. They simply positioned themselves, watching, waiting, gathering information the same way I was gathering it from orbit. I found this fascinating in a way I had not expected. My files described humans as impulsive and quick to violence when threatened, yet here they were, showing a level of restraint that did not match anything I had recorded before. The Thresher soldiers reached the edge of the nearest building, a structure I identified as a school based on the shapes moving inside it earlier that morning. My monitors detected something that made my sensors spike with concern I did not expect to feel. Children, dozens of them, gathered inside, having been moved there during an earlier drill that local authorities apparently ran with surprising speed the moment the landing craft appeared on their instruments. The Thresher soldiers paused at the entrance, clearly expecting no resistance from a structure filled with what their scanners likely identified as small, weak life forms. What they did not expect, and what I did not expect either, was the row of adult humans standing between them and the doorway. Teachers, parents, ordinary people with no weapons, no armor, nothing but their own bodies forming a wall in front of a building filled with children who trusted them to keep it safe. The Thresher commander's voice crackled through my translated feed again, this time with a note of irritation rather than amusement. He ordered the humans to step aside, warning them that resistance would not be tolerated. Daniel, still standing near the landing craft, raised his voice, loud enough for his people to hear across the field, telling them to hold their position and wait for reinforcements that were already on their way. I paused my recording for a moment, something I rarely do during an active observation, because I needed to process what I was seeing. This was not the disorganized panic my files predicted. This was coordination happening in real time, spreading across a region with a speed that suggested deep planning long before this exact threat ever existed. I began searching my archives for any prior data explaining how a species with such constant internal conflict could organize this quickly against an external threat, and I found nothing that fully explained it. It was as if every argument, every rivalry, every border dispute I had spent months recording simply paused the moment something larger threatened all of them at once. The standoff outside the school lasted only a few more minutes before Thresher patience ran out. The commander gave an order I understood immediately from his tone, even before my translation system finished processing the words. His soldiers raised their weapons toward the line of unarmed adults blocking the entrance. I remember thinking, in that exact instant, that my report was about to write itself in the worst possible way. I remember bracing for data I did not want to record. I remember the strange, unfamiliar tightness in my chest that I had never experienced during any previous observation assignment. Then the sky above the field lit up with a sound I had not expected from a species my files called primitive. Aircraft. Fast, low, human-built, arriving from 3 different directions at once. Not massive by Concorde standards, but clearly military, clearly coordinated, and clearly not something the Thresher scanners had accounted for when they labeled this planet an easy target. The aircraft did not fire immediately. Instead, they created a controlled disruption, forcing the Thresher soldiers to break formation and look upward, buying just enough time for the line of adults at the school entrance to pull the children inside and seal the doors. The Thresher commander's calm evaporated entirely. Through my feed, I heard him demanding an explanation from his own sensor operators, asking how a species his own intelligence reports called technologically insignificant had produced coordinated air support this quickly. No one on his ship had an answer, because the truthful answer was something none of them understood yet. Humans were not improvising a defense from nothing. They were adapting, faster than any species I had ever observed, using resources they already had in ways the Threshers never bothered to study before arriving. I switched my monitors to a wider view, trying to understand the scale of what was unfolding. What I found changed the entire shape of my report before I had even written a single line of it. This was not an isolated response from one small region. Communication networks across the human world were lighting up with the same emergency signal, alerting other nations, other governments, other militaries to the exact same threat. Countries that had spent generations arguing over borders and resources were suddenly exchanging information without hesitation, sharing satellite data, sharing tactical assessments, sharing warnings. I want to be honest about something. In that moment, I still did not believe humanity could win. My training told me technology gaps this large were rarely closed through effort alone. The Threshers possessed weapons and armor generations ahead of anything I had recorded on this planet. I assumed, even as I watched this surprising coordination unfold, that I was simply witnessing a slightly longer, slightly more dignified version of the same outcome my files had always predicted. A brave resistance, perhaps. A story worth noting in my report, but not a victory. The Thresher commander apparently reached a similar conclusion, because his tone shifted from irritation back to something closer to confidence. He ordered his forces to abandon the school and return focus to the landing site, deciding that a show of overwhelming force against the gathering human military response would end this disruption quickly. His soldiers began repositioning, weapons raised toward the approaching aircraft and the growing perimeter of ground vehicles. Daniel's voice came through again, calmer than I expected given the situation, speaking not to the Threshers this time, but into a communication device connected to what I assumed was a larger command structure. He gave coordinates. He gave a status update. He gave an order of his own, one that made my sensors register a spike in incoming signals from military installations far beyond the immediate region. I did not understand the full scope of what was happening until my long-range scanners detected something entering the upper atmosphere that had not been there an hour earlier. More aircraft, naval vessels repositioning along nearby coastlines, satellite systems shifting focus toward the landing site with a precision that suggested years of preparation for exactly this kind of unexpected scenario, even though nothing like this had ever happened on this world before. I realized, watching all of this unfold across my monitors, that humanity's constant internal conflict had left behind something the Threshers never accounted for. Every rivalry between nations had also built enormous, capable militaries, each one designed to respond quickly to threats from other humans. None of those militaries were built with an alien invasion in mind, yet the systems, the training, the coordination all existed anyway, ready to be redirected the moment a threat appeared that was larger than any of their old arguments. The Thresher commander gave the order to escalate. His soldiers advanced toward the tightening perimeter of human forces, weapons raised, confidence restored by the belief that this display of force would end the standoff quickly, the same way it had ended countless standoffs on countless other worlds across their long history of conquest. I watched the first shots fired, not from the Threshers, but from a defensive position I had not even noticed forming along the tree line at the edge of the field. A warning, precise and controlled, aimed not at the soldiers themselves, but at the ground just ahead of their advancing line. A message, clear even without words. Stop. The Thresher commander did not stop. I felt my hands tighten around the edge of my console as I watched his forces continue their advance, weapons raised toward the human line, completely certain that whatever resistance they were facing could not possibly match the power of their own arsenal. I did not know it yet, but I was about to witness the exact moment this entire situation turned into something no Thresher commander in their long, brutal history had ever prepared for. I was about to watch the true nature of this species reveal itself, not in their disagreements, not in their old borders and old arguments, but in the terrifying unity they were capable of the moment something threatened everyone at once. My draft report, the one predicting a quiet, forgettable defeat, sat unfinished on my screen. I closed it without saving a single word. Something told me I was about to need a very different report entirely. The Thresher line kept advancing, and the human defenders along the tree line held their position without retreating a single step. I remember thinking that this was the moment my files had always predicted, the moment where a technologically superior force simply rolled over a species too small and too disorganized to stop it. I remember being wrong again, more completely than I had ever been wrong about anything in my career. The second warning shot never came. Instead, the ground beneath the advancing Thresher soldiers erupted in controlled bursts of light and sound, not enough to end their advance entirely, but enough to break their formation into scattered, confused groups. I checked my sensors twice, certain I had misread the data, because the pattern I was seeing did not match anything a species with primitive technology should have been capable of producing. This was not random defensive fire. This was a planned response, positioned in advance, waiting for exactly this moment. I began to understand something important as I watched the Thresher soldiers regroup under fire. Humanity had not built this response in the hours since the landing craft appeared. They had built it over generations, through every one of those small, meaningless conflicts my old reports dismissed as unremarkable. Every border dispute had produced better defensive strategy. Every rivalry had produced faster communication networks. Every old war I had recorded with mild disappointment had quietly built the foundation for a species that could organize a coordinated defense against an unknown enemy within a matter of hours. The Thresher commander's voice returned to my translated feed, sharper now, demanding his soldiers hold formation and push through what he still believed was a minor obstacle. I could hear something new underneath his confidence, a thread of confusion that had not been there before. His scanners were feeding him information that did not match his expectations, the same way my own sensors were feeding me information that did not match mine. Daniel's voice came through the human communication channels again, calm and direct, giving instructions to units I could not fully identify from my position in orbit. I watched vehicles reposition along secondary roads, moving with a coordination that suggested a plan far larger than the single field where this confrontation had begun. I realized, watching the wider region light up with activity, that this was never going to be a single battle. This was becoming something far larger, spreading outward from that first landing site, like ripples across still water. The Thresher landing craft, still sitting at the center of the field, activated additional systems I had not seen before. Its hull opened along several new sections, releasing smaller support units, compact machines designed to reinforce the ground soldiers with heavier firepower. I felt my chest tighten again, the same unfamiliar sensation from earlier, because I understood immediately that this level of force was designed to end resistance permanently, not simply push it back. I expected the human response to falter here. Instead, something happened that made me question every assumption I had ever built about this species over my months of observation. The moment those support units activated, human forces did not retreat to reassess. They adapted immediately, shifting their positions, redirecting their aircraft toward new targets, adjusting their communication in real time based on information I could see flowing between different units with startling speed. I noticed something else as well, something that struck me as deeply strange for a species I had always understood to be driven primarily by self-interest. Throughout this entire engagement, human forces were making consistent efforts to draw the confrontation away from populated areas. Vehicles that could have taken faster, more direct routes instead moved along paths that led the growing conflict toward open land, away from homes, away from the school, away from anywhere civilians might still be present. I checked this pattern 3 times, certain I was misreading it, because nothing in my training suggested a species under this level of threat would prioritize protecting strangers over protecting themselves most efficiently. The Thresher support units advanced into the open field, and this time the human response was faster and more coordinated than anything I had recorded before. I watched the aircraft that arrived earlier begin working in tandem with the ground forces, striking specific points along the Thresher formation with a precision that suggested they had already identified weaknesses in the enemy technology within the span of a single engagement. I found this almost impossible to believe, yet my own sensors confirmed it repeatedly. This species was learning faster than any opponent I had ever read about in Concord military archives, faster than my own people typically learned in similar first-contact conflicts. The Thresher commander's confidence cracked further. I heard him contact his ship in orbit, requesting additional deployment, his voice carrying a tension that had not existed in his earlier dismissive tone. Somewhere above the atmosphere, a second, larger vessel began adjusting its position, preparing to send down reinforcements that would dwarf the initial landing force. My sensors detected this movement immediately, and I understood that whatever restraint the Threshers had shown so far was about to disappear entirely. I want to describe what happened over the following hours as clearly and honestly as I can, because this is the part of my report that changed everything I understood about this small, blue planet. As the second wave of Thresher forces began descending, human military networks across the entire region synchronized into something far larger than the local response that had started this engagement. I watched satellite feeds shift, tracking every movement of the incoming reinforcements before they even reached the lower atmosphere. I watched multiple nations, ones that had been recorded arguing over minor disputes just days earlier, share targeting data with a trust that suggested old rivalries had been set aside completely the moment a threat larger than themselves appeared. The Thresher reinforcements broke through the clouds, expecting to find a disorganized, retreating enemy. Instead, they found a defense that had already repositioned, already adapted, already prepared countermeasures based on everything learned from the first engagement. I watched their formation scatter almost immediately upon entry, caught off guard by coordinated ground fire and aircraft positioned in locations that should not have been possible to predict in advance. The Thresher commander's voice grew louder, more frantic, demanding explanations from officers who had none to give him. I understood his confusion completely, because I shared it. Nothing about this response matched the intelligence reports the Threshers had clearly relied on before choosing this planet as a target. Nothing about it matched my own reports either, the ones I had filed with quiet disappointment about a species too disorganized to ever pose a threat to anyone. I began to understand, watching this unfold, that the mistake both the Threshers and my own people had made was the same mistake. We looked at humanity's constant internal conflict and assumed it meant weakness. We never considered that it might instead be a form of constant practice, a species perpetually testing and refining its ability to organize, to fight, to adapt, simply never doing it against a common enemy large enough to unite them completely. Now that enemy had arrived, and everything I thought I understood about this world was being rewritten in real time. The battle spread beyond the original field, moving into surrounding areas as both sides adjusted their positions. I tracked the human response, spreading through coordinated waves, never chaotic despite the pressure, always adjusting, always improving with each passing exchange. I watched the Threshers, so confident just hours earlier, begin making decisions that suggested growing desperation, decisions that did not match the calculated, patient approach their species was known for across every other conquered world in their long history. Daniel's voice remained steady throughout, coordinating across channels that connected to what I now understood was a rapidly assembling joint command structure, pulling together resources from multiple nations into a single unified response. I found myself, for the first time since arriving at this posting, genuinely uncertain about how this would end. My training told me the technology gap should have made the outcome inevitable. My own eyes told me something entirely different was happening. Hours passed, and the confrontation showed no sign of ending in the quick, one-sided defeat I had originally predicted. If anything, the human response grew stronger with time, not weaker, as more resources arrived, as more coordination solidified, as the initial confusion of the first encounter gave way to a defense that operated with startling clarity and purpose. I remember the exact moment I stopped thinking of this as a simple observation assignment. It happened when I realized the Thresher commander, a being trained across countless successful conquests, had begun requesting permission from his own superiors to consider a full withdrawal. I had never recorded this in any of my studies of Thresher military history. Their reputation across 3 sectors was built on an absolute refusal to retreat from any target once an engagement began. Yet here, on a small planet his own intelligence reports called insignificant, he was questioning whether continuing was even possible. I did not know yet how this confrontation would end. I did not know whether the Threshers would push forward with even greater force, or whether they would finally recognize what I was only beginning to understand myself. This was not a weak, disorganized species stumbling into an unexpected fight. This was a species that had spent its entire history preparing for exactly this kind of moment, without ever realizing it themselves, until the moment arrived and every old argument, every old rivalry, every skill, built through generations of conflict, came together into something far more dangerous than anyone outside this planet had ever predicted. My sensors continued recording every detail, every movement, every decision made on both sides. My hands had stopped shaking by this point, replaced by something closer to focused urgency, because I understood now that whatever happened next was going to become one of the most important reports of my entire career. Not because of what it would say about the Threshers, because of what it would say about humanity, and about how badly every outside observer, myself included, had misunderstood them from the very beginning. The sky above the field grew darker as more forces arrived from both sides, and I settled deeper into my chair, unable to look away from the unfolding confrontation, knowing that whatever came next would be unlike anything I had ever recorded in my career as an observer of small, forgotten worlds. What happened next unfolded faster than I could properly process, even with sensors designed to record events far quicker than any organic mind could follow. I will try to describe it the way my instruments captured it, because words alone struggle to carry the weight of what I witnessed over those final hours. The Thresher commander received his answer from his superiors, and it was not the permission to withdraw that his tone had suggested he hoped for. Instead, his orders were to escalate completely, to end the resistance below through overwhelming force, treating this small, previously unlisted world as an example rather than a simple resource target. I understood immediately what this meant. The Threshers had decided that losing to a species this technologically behind them was unacceptable, a threat to their reputation across every other world watching their movements from a distance. Their main vessel in orbit began powering weapons systems far beyond anything used in the ground engagement so far. My sensors detected the buildup immediately, and for the first time since this entire event began, I felt something close to genuine dread rather than scientific curiosity. This was no longer a contained skirmish over a single field. This was becoming an attempt to remove humanity's ability to resist entirely, delivered from a position the people below had no way of reaching or stopping. I watched human communication networks light up again, faster this time, coordinating a response to a threat now originating from orbit rather than the ground. I did not understand how they detected the Thresher ship's weapon activation so quickly until I realized their own satellite network, built originally to watch each other during old disputes, had been repurposed within hours to track every movement of the invading force. The same systems built out of old rivalries were now humanity's early warning against a threat none of them had ever imagined facing. Daniel's voice returned to the communication channels, steadier than I expected given what was building above him, giving what I understood to be evacuation orders for the surrounding region. I watched vehicles move civilians away from the area with an efficiency that suggested this exact kind of large-scale evacuation had been practiced many times before, even if never for a reason like this. The Thresher vessel released its first strike from orbit, a concentrated burst aimed at what I identified as a military coordination point near the original landing site. I braced myself for the outcome, certain this was the moment where the technology gap finally became too large to overcome. Instead, my sensors detected something human forces had prepared during the hours of ground fighting that came before. A defensive countermeasure, crude by Concord standards, but effective enough to disperse and weaken the strike before it reached its intended target. I sat back from my console, genuinely stunned. I had never recorded a species developing effective countermeasures against orbital weaponry within hours of first encountering the threat. My files on similar first-contact conflicts across the galaxy described defeats measured in minutes, not prolonged engagements measured in hours, where the technologically inferior side kept adapting faster than their opponent could adjust. The Thresher commander's frustration was clear in every transmission I intercepted afterward. His forces on the ground continued losing coordinated engagements against a defense that seemed to anticipate their movements before they made them. His vessel in orbit found its attacks blunted by countermeasures that should not have existed on a world his own intelligence reports called primitive. Every assumption his species had built about this conquest was collapsing in real time, and I could hear it in the growing tension of his voice. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for the accuracy of my report. Throughout this entire engagement, human forces continued showing a pattern I found genuinely remarkable. Whenever Thresher soldiers attempted to surrender, whenever their vehicles were disabled and their crews raised the universal signal for retreat, human forces held their fire and allowed safe passage away from active combat zones. I recorded this happening multiple times, confirmed across different regions, different units, different commanders. This was not the behavior of a species driven purely by anger or revenge. This was a species capable of drawing a clear line between necessary defense and unnecessary harm, even in the middle of the most dangerous encounter of their entire history. At the same time, I recorded something else, something that revealed a different side of this species entirely. Whenever Thresher forces continued advancing despite clear warnings, whenever they targeted areas where civilians had not yet finished evacuating, the human response shifted immediately from measured defense to complete, focused determination. There was no hesitation in these moments, no uncertainty. Whatever mercy humanity showed to those who stopped fighting disappeared entirely against those who did not. The Thresher commander made his final decision as the battle stretched into its later hours, ordering every remaining unit into a single, concentrated push toward the strongest point of human resistance, hoping that overwhelming numbers in one location could finally break through where scattered engagements had failed. I understood watching this unfold, that this was the moment that would decide everything. If human forces could not hold this position, the entire coordinated defense might finally begin to collapse under the weight of a single, focused assault. I watched the Thresher forces converge, their remaining ground units and support vehicles forming into a single advancing line aimed at the heart of the human defensive position. I watched human forces respond, not with matching numbers, because they simply did not have equivalent firepower to match a full Thresher assault, but with something else entirely. Precision. Every strike aimed at the exact weak points their hours of fighting had already identified in Thresher technology. Every movement coordinated across units that had learned to communicate as if they had trained together for years, despite representing military forces from different nations that had never fought alongside each other before this day. The Thresher line broke apart under the pressure of an assault they never expected a supposedly primitive species to be capable of delivering. I watched their formation scatter into confusion, their commander's voice growing more desperate with each passing transmission, ordering retreats that came too late to save the cohesion his forces needed to remain effective. I recorded the final collapse of organized Thresher resistance on the ground, roughly 20 hours after the landing craft first touched down in that quiet coastal field. Their remaining forces either surrendered, following the same safe retreat pattern human forces had allowed throughout the engagement, or fled back toward what remained of their support vehicles in a disorganized retreat that bore no resemblance to the calculated, patient conquest they had planned when they first entered this system. The vessel in orbit, seeing its ground forces broken and its own attacks consistently blunted by countermeasures that continued improving with every attempt, made the decision its commander had wanted to make hours earlier: withdrawal. I watched the ship power its engines and begin retreating from the system entirely, abandoning the remaining soldiers still scattered across the field below, rather than risk further losses against a species that had proven itself far more capable than any intelligence report had predicted. I sat in my chair afterward, surrounded by silent monitors, finally free of the constant alarms that had filled my platform for nearly a full day. My hands, I noticed, had stopped shaking sometime during those final hours, replaced by a strange stillness I did not fully understand until much later. I was no longer watching this planet the way I had when I arrived. I was no longer seeing a disorganized, forgettable species barely worth a footnote in Concord records. I was seeing something else entirely, something my training had never properly prepared me to recognize. A species whose constant internal conflict had quietly built the foundation for a defense capable of turning back a force from beyond their own sky within a single day, using nothing but resources, coordination, and a willingness to adapt faster than any opponent could adjust to them. I began reviewing my recordings from the beginning, watching the entire sequence again with new understanding. The disorganized arguments I once dismissed as evidence of weakness now looked like generations of practice. The old rivalries I once recorded with mild disappointment now looked like the very thing that built militaries capable of responding within minutes to a threat none of them had ever imagined facing. Every assumption in my original reports had been wrong, not because my observations were inaccurate, but because I had misunderstood what those observations actually meant. The field below, once quiet and ordinary, now sat scarred and silent, marked by the remains of a conflict that would likely never be fully understood by anyone outside this planet, except for the small, careful report I was about to write. I stared at my monitors for a long time before finally opening a new document, uncertain how to begin describing what I had just witnessed in a way my superiors would actually believe. I had come to this posting expecting to record the quiet, predictable decline of a forgettable species. I had ended up witnessing something closer to a warning, one I was not sure the rest of the galaxy was prepared to hear. I spent the following 2 days doing something I had never done before in my entire career as an observer. I rewatched every recording from the beginning of my posting, not as a bored researcher looking for confirmation of what he already believed, but as someone trying to understand exactly how badly he had misjudged an entire species. I watched the old border disputes again, the small arguments between neighboring nations, the disagreements over resources that I once described in my reports as evidence of a fractured, disorganized world. This time, I watched them differently, searching for the patterns hidden underneath the surface conflict, the patterns that had quietly prepared this species for a moment none of them ever expected to face. I found something in almost every old recording that I had completely overlooked before. Beneath every disagreement, there was structure, communication networks refined through decades of tension, emergency response systems built and rebuilt through repeated small crises. Military coordination developed not because any single nation expected to face an alien invasion, but because they needed to be ready to respond quickly to threats from each other. None of it was designed with the Threshers in mind, yet all of it became exactly what was needed the moment a threat larger than any of their old arguments finally arrived. I thought about the file I had read before accepting this posting, the one that called humans short-lived, disorganized, and unlikely to ever become anything more than a minor curiosity for researchers like myself. I thought about how confidently that file had been written, how certain its authors had been in their conclusions, and how completely wrong those conclusions turned out to be. I understood now that the mistake was not in the observations themselves. Humans really were quick to disagree, quick to argue, quick to divide themselves along countless different lines. The mistake was assuming that this meant weakness, rather than recognizing it as a constant, ongoing rehearsal for exactly the kind of coordinated response I had just watched unfold across an entire planet in less than a single day. I began drafting my report to the Concord Research Council on the third day, knowing that whatever I wrote would need to be far more careful and detailed than any report I had ever submitted before. This was not a simple update on the behavioral patterns of a minor species. This was a warning that needed to reach people who had spent generations assuming this particular world posed no risk to anyone. A warning that would likely be met with skepticism from officials who had never watched what I had just watched with my own instruments. I structured the report the way my training taught me, starting with a summary of events before moving into detailed analysis. I described the Thresher incursion factually, without exaggeration, listing their initial assessment of the planet, their confidence in an easy conquest, and the specific moment their assumptions began to unravel. I described humanity's response with the same careful precision, avoiding the kind of emotional language that might make my superiors dismiss the report as an overreaction from a junior researcher who had simply never witnessed real conflict before. I included every piece of data I had gathered. The speed of their military coordination, the rapid development of countermeasures against orbital weaponry, the consistent pattern of restraint shown toward those who stopped fighting contrasted against the complete determination shown toward those who continued advancing despite clear warning. I wanted my superiors to understand not just that humanity had won this engagement, but how they had won it, and why that mattered far more than the outcome of a single confrontation with one aggressive empire. I also included something I was not required to include, something that went beyond the standard format for observation reports. A personal note, addressed directly to whoever would review this file, explaining my own change in understanding. I wrote about arriving at this posting expecting a punishment assignment, watching a species my entire department considered unremarkable. I wrote about my growing disappointment during the early months of observation, and how completely that disappointment had been replaced by something closer to genuine respect, tempered with a caution I did not fully understand myself until I had lived through those 20 hours of conflict. I recommended a full reclassification of Earth's status within Concord records, not as a protected world in need of guidance or assistance, which is how most young civilizations are eventually categorized once they reach a certain level of development. Instead, I recommended a classification I had rarely seen used before, reserved for species considered capable of defending themselves without any outside intervention, and dangerous enough that any future contact should proceed with extreme caution rather than the usual careful curiosity applied to less developed worlds. I submitted the report and waited, uncertain how it would be received. I did not have to wait long before receiving a response, though it was not the kind of response I expected. Several senior researchers within my department requested additional verification, clearly skeptical that a species previously classified as harmless could have produced the kind of coordinated defense my report described. I understood their skepticism completely, because I would have shared it myself before I witnessed the events firsthand. I provided the full recordings, unedited, allowing them to review the entire sequence exactly as it happened, rather than relying solely on my written summary. The response that followed changed the tone of every future communication I received from my department. Officials who had once treated my posting as an unimportant assignment began requesting detailed briefings, asking specific questions about human military coordination, about the speed of their technological adaptation, about the exact patterns of restraint and determination I had documented throughout the conflict. I found myself, for the first time in my career, being taken seriously by people who had previously considered my work barely worth reading. I remained at my posting for several more months after submitting the report, continuing to observe Earth with an entirely different perspective than the one I arrived with. I watched human society return to something resembling normal life in the aftermath of the confrontation, though I noticed subtle changes that had not existed before. Some communication networks between nations remained more open than they had been previously, as if the shared experience of facing an external threat had left behind a lasting impression, even among people who quickly returned to their old disagreements once the immediate danger had passed. I thought often about Daniel, the officer who had first stepped forward to meet the Thresher soldiers without any weapon of his own, and who had coordinated much of the defense that followed. I never made contact with him, following Concord Protocol strictly despite everything I had witnessed, but I continued observing his role within the response efforts that followed the withdrawal of Thresher forces. I found myself genuinely curious about a person I had once viewed as nothing more than a data point in a routine observation report, curious in a way my training had never encouraged before this posting. I also thought about the Threshers, wondering how their withdrawal would be recorded within their own military records, wondering whether their commander would face consequences for a defeat that must have seemed impossible before it happened. I checked restricted Concord channels occasionally for any information about Thresher movements following their retreat, and found reports suggesting their forces avoided this region of space entirely in the following months, likely reassessing their intelligence-gathering methods after such an unexpected and costly failure. Nearly a full year after the initial incursion, I received formal confirmation that my recommendation had been accepted. Earth's classification within Concord records was updated, moving humanity from a minor curiosity barely worth mentioning to a species marked for careful, distant observation only, with clear guidance that any future contact should proceed with significant caution. I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and unease reading that confirmation, satisfaction that my report had been taken seriously, unease at knowing exactly what kind of world would eventually discover it was no longer alone in the universe, and exactly what that world was capable of when threatened. I requested a transfer away from this posting shortly after receiving that confirmation, not because I had grown tired of observing humanity, but because I felt I had learned everything my current position could teach me, and because watching this particular species without ever being able to speak with them directly had become a strange kind of quiet torment. I wanted to understand more about the individuals I had watched from such a distance, about Daniel and the countless others whose names I never learned, whose ordinary lives had been interrupted by an extraordinary threat they met with a courage and coordination that reshaped my entire understanding of their species. My transfer was approved, and I left my posting knowing that someone else within my department would continue monitoring Earth from this point forward, following the updated protocols my report had helped establish. Before I departed, I recorded one final entry into my personal files, separate from the official Concord report, something closer to a reflection than a scientific observation. I wrote that I had arrived at this assignment, believing I would witness nothing more than the slow, unremarkable decline of a forgettable species, exactly as my original file predicted. I wrote that, instead, I had witnessed something closer to a warning delivered to the rest of the galaxy, a demonstration of what happens when a species built through generations of internal conflict finally faces a threat large enough to unite them completely. I wrote that I had come expecting to observe humans. Instead, I witnessed something the galaxy was not prepared for, and something I suspected very few species beyond this small, quiet planet would ever fully understand until they made the same mistake the Threshers had made. I closed my final entry with a single line, one I hoped would eventually be read by every researcher who ever considered this world unremarkable again. I came to observe humans. What I witnessed instead was a massacre, delivered not by a stronger enemy against the weak, but by a species the entire galaxy had underestimated, defending everything they had ever built with a unity none of us ever believed they were capable of showing.